Hello and welcome to this video on smoking, which is a GCSE topic if you're doing Biology GCSE Edexcel, and it's also quite an important life topic as well. So this is obviously something that a lot of people still do, and it's quite important to know the dangers of actually smoking. So in terms of smoking, there are three main chemicals that you need to know about. So one of them is nicotine, the other one is tar, and the final one is carbon monoxide. Now, each of these have their own separate effects on the human body, and as you can guess, they're all bad. They also lead to a variety of smoking related diseases, which you'll also need to know about. So, if we start with nicotine first, right? Nicotine basically does a few things, but the main thing it does is constrict your blood vessels. So, what do we mean by constricting your blood vessels? Well, we mean your blood vessels going from this to this. Essentially, it has made your blood vessels smaller, okay? That's crucial to understanding this. So if your blood vessels are smaller, if you remember the physics equation, pressure equals force over area. And if there's a smaller area, then basically there's going to be more pressure inside your blood vessels. Now, what does that lead to? Well, it increases your chances of a stroke and a heart attack, or as we scientifically call it, a myocardial infarction. But you can just write heart attack. Also, critically, nicotine is extremely addictive, right? So if this is your brain, right, that is the worst drawing of the brain I've ever seen. But if that's your brain, nicotine essentially, what it does is it speeds up your nervous impulses. So if this is the rest of your body, this is your spinal cord, etc., these are your nerves. It's basically allowing signals from your brain to travel quicker to your nerves, or vice versa as well. Now, what that allows essentially is for the person to feel more alert. So, if you are smoking and you have your nicotine is affecting you, you essentially have this feeling of alertness, but it can also lead to anxiety as well. Now, essentially, now that you're alert, it for many people this is a good feeling, and that's important to understand, and that's why we call nicotine addictive. Now, by an addictive substance, not only do you want to have nicotine, but crucially, over time, you need more and more nicotine to have the same feeling. So, if this is just a rough graph, as time progresses and this is the amount of nicotine, you're going to need more and more to have the same feeling of alertness. So, that's nicotine for you, right? The next substance that we need to look at is tar. Now, tar is kind of a black substance, and critically, this is something that you need to know. It's called a carcinogen. Now, what is a carcinogen? Well, a carcinogen is a substance that promotes the development of cancer. And obviously, you know what cancer is, which is mutations in your cells, DNA, which eventually stop cells' natural apoptosis, if I spell that for you here, which basically is when cells die. And cells are programmed to die. In simple terms, they are programmed to die, but cancer cells decide not to die, and they decide to multiply, taking the body's resources, eventually becoming a tumor that can eventually kill you. So, as I said, a carcinogen is a substance that promotes the development of cancer. Now, I recommend that you learn that definition as well. It's quite important. So, tar causing cancer, but it also causes a variety of smoking related diseases that we will learn later, including emphysema, chronic bronchitis, and coronary heart disease. So that's tar for you. And the final substance that we need to know about is carbon monoxide. Now, carbon monoxide is probably least likely to come up on your test, but it's still important to know about. If you want to know the chemical equation for it, it's CO. I don't think you need to know this in a biology test. But carbon monoxide, crucially, is very similar to oxygen. And essentially, your red blood cells contain a pigment called hemoglobin, which oxygen binds to form oxyhemoglobin. Now, oxyhemoglobin essentially is transported on your red blood cells throughout your body. And that is how oxygen is delivered to cells, which is needed for aerobic respiration. But carbon monoxide, it turns out, is very similar to hemoglobin. And instead of making oxyhemoglobin, it binds to your red blood cells to make carboxyhemoglobin. Now, the thing is, when oxygen binds to your red blood cells, it's called a reversible reaction. Because then it's simply, the reaction is reversed, so the oxygen can be used in aerobic respiration. But when carbon monoxide binds to your red blood cells, it is non-reversible. So your red blood cells are now carrying around this carbon monoxide for around 3 months until they eventually die. So what you end up with is red blood cells that are essentially useless and are not carrying around oxygen around the body. And to keep the supply of oxygen up, because now you're not getting enough oxygen, basically you end up breathing more. So breathing frequency, this is important. Breathing. So if they ask you the effects of carbon monoxide on the body, breathing frequency and breathing volume increase to try and compensate for the decreased supply of oxygen. Also, the heart is going to pump faster, raising blood pressure and then increasing the risk of a stroke. Now, we've gone through all of the main chemicals in smoking that you need to know for GCSE. Now it's time to go through some of the smoking related diseases. So the first is bronchitis, which is kind of chronic bronchitis, but we can just call it bronchitis for now. So due to tar, essentially there are cells in your body called goblet cells, right? And these line your esophagus, and essentially they contain these things here, these little hairs. They're called cilia. And these cilia, very important word, you have to say this word, you can't say move, or they waft mucus up your throat, okay? And mucus essentially contains, as I'm sure you know, bacteria and other things that we don't really want inside our body. So these cilia that are wafting mucus up your throat, due to tar, they become, if this is the black stuff here is tar, they become kind of trapped. They can't waft anything up. And essentially this leads the bacteria to stay in your throat, which can obviously lead to an infection because now you have bacteria and stuff still in your esophagus, still in your throat, which can easily move to your lungs as well. And this mucus buildup causes wheezing and difficulty breathing. And you develop something known as a smoker's cough. So if you see a smoker and they're always coughing, this is why, right? The smoker's cough is an attempt to remove this mucus because your cilia aren't wafting it up. And it's a chronic cough. And by chronic, we mean something that is always, like, it's not able to be reversed, right? It's not because of an external infection. It's now become permanent due to somebody's choices, smoking, essentially, in this instance. So that's bronchitis. Now we go on to the next one, which is called emphysema. This is the one a lot of people don't like because they feel it's a bit complicated. But essentially, so building on what we said in bronchitis about how smokers are going to have more infections due to their cilia being damaged, essentially, you have your immune cells. Let's just call them phagocytes, right? There's different types of immune cells. But the phagocytes, essentially what they do is, pretend that's a phagocyte, they engulf a bacteria. And we call this phagocytosis, right? But because there's so many infections in the lungs now, the phagocytes are always there, essentially. And essentially, this can lead to inflammation because the phagocytes are you have lymphocytes as well, secreting chemicals. You have phagocytes basically engulfing cells, causing damage to healthy cells as well. And what this leads to is the breakdown of the alveolar walls. If that's what they used to look like before, and that the top picture is what they used to look like before, and the bottom one is what they look like now. Now, the alveoli are tiny air sacs where gas exchange takes place. And if they are damaged, basically, what this is, you need to say this, it leaves a reduced surface area for gas exchange. And there's less surface area for oxygen to diffuse across, so less oxygen gets into the blood. And this is why patients with emphysema often need to use ventilators. But crucially, if you get an exam question about this, this is why they often feel tired and weak. Because there's less oxygen in the blood, which means that less oxygen is available for cells to use aerobic respiration, and therefore less oxygen is available for things like muscle contraction as well. And also, you could also argue that you have anaerobic respiration taking place, which produces lactic acid, which also would make a person feel tired, right? Next one of the major ones that you need to know is called coronary heart disease. It's a very interesting one. Coronary heart disease. Now, coronary heart disease affects the coronary arteries, which are essentially arteries which are blood vessels, that supply oxygen and glucose to the cardiac muscle. So if this is my oxygen, and my O2, and my glucose, my C6H12O6, and this is my coronary arteries. My cardiac muscle, essentially. So the heart muscle. However, in coronary heart disease, there's a buildup of something called plaque, okay? So pretend this red stuff here is plaque. And plaque is essentially fatty material. And this can often build up naturally due to poor diet, etc. And normally it's not too big of a deal. But in coronary heart disease, what you end up with is almost a total blocking of the coronary arteries with this plaque, or the partial blocking, right? So basically, you get a lot of blockage of the coronary arteries, which leads to restricted blood flow to the cardiac muscle. Because obviously, you're going to have less oxygen and glucose coming to the cardiac muscle now. And this leads to something called, if in a partial blockage, it's called angina, which is essentially a fancy way of saying chest pain, but it is quite a serious condition. If you do have it, you do need to go to the hospital. You need medication. And then also, in the complete blockage of aerobic respiration, it leads to myocardial infarction, which is a heart attack. Now, how does smoking cause this? So tar essentially, what it does is it increases the buildup of plaque, right? So more plaque is essentially made. Sorry, my handwriting is not very good today. And carbon monoxide also contributes by making it harder for red blood cells to carry oxygen to the cardiac muscle. So obviously, as we said before, carbon monoxide reduces the capacity of red blood cells to carry oxyhemoglobin, and this is also going to compound coronary heart disease because now there's not as much oxygen being carried, so there's also going to be less oxygen available for aerobic respiration. Now, we're quickly going to touch on two more things that smoking affects. So obviously, smoking increases your risk of lung cancer. And this is very quick. Smoking damages our DNA and increases the risk of mutations, which essentially is going to lead to a higher risk of developing something like lung cancer in the future. So smoking is the leading cause of lung cancer. And obviously, that means that your chances of developing lung cancer exponentially increase with the amount of time that you smoked for. And let's just be clear with that. It's the amount of time that you smoked for. Some exam questions ask you to distinguish between the amount of time that somebody smoked and the time that they've stopped smoking. Remember, they're different things. Somebody who smoked for 2 years and stopped at 50 is going to have a much lower chance of developing lung cancer than somebody who has smoked for 20 years but stopped at 40. Okay, the final one that we need to talk about is pregnancy. And it's always recommended that pregnant women, if they were smoking before, you have to stop smoking. It's absolutely critical that you stop smoking if you are a pregnant woman, because what you're going to do essentially is harm the development of your own child. So as we said before, nicotine constricts blood vessels, and there just so happens to be a very important thing, basically blood vessel, that leads to your baby. This is my really bad drawing, but we call this an umbilical cord. And if you are constricting this is obviously not very good, because the umbilical cord is delivering all the nutrients to the baby that's going to be needed for its growth. This is a very interesting drawing of the baby, but you get the point. So if this is constricted, essentially you're going to lead less nutrients now to the baby. And this is going to affect the baby's development. And what you see is a drastic decrease in the birth size of the baby, even after a full-term pregnancy. And also increases the risk of something called sudden infant death syndrome. This, I don't think you have to write this in your exam, but it's also quite interesting to know. So in some babies, they just, as the name suggests, spontaneously die, also known as cot death for some people. And this has been shown to be increased with the risk of this increases with smoking in mothers after birth as well. Remember as well, smoking can also lead to behavioral issues in children, as well as hearing loss and respiratory issues. So that is everything that you need to know on smoking for your GCSE exams. As always, I recommend that you make notes on this, maybe watch the video again. And I would appreciate a like and subscribe, maybe a share as well. This is everything on smoking for the Edexcel IGCSE. However, I'm sure it can be applicable to other exam boards as well. I'd like to thank you for listening to this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.